I'm going to need you to gather your things and stand up, ma'am. This gentleman will be taking your seat." The words arrived not as a question, not as a request, but as a conclusion that had already been reached somewhere before Simone Carter had even noticed the woman standing over her. And for a long moment, Simone simply looked up at the flight attendant with the particular stillness of someone who had learned very early in life that the first reaction is rarely the right one. The first-class cabin of Meridian Airways Flight 447 was exactly the kind of space that had been designed to feel inevitable, soft amber lighting that turned the cream leather seats into something approaching luxury. The faint scent of recycled air and expensive cologne. The muted sounds of passengers settling in with the unhurried ease of people accustomed to being comfortable in elevated spaces. And until 30 seconds ago, Simone had been one of them, her boarding pass showing Seat 2A, her navy dress pressed and deliberate, her champagne flute cold against the back of her fingers as she reviewed the contract notes on her tablet. The flight attendant's name tag read, Brittany Hale, and her hair was platinum blonde pulled back into a chignon so tight it looked architectural, and her uniform was the kind of immaculate that suggested it had never encountered anything as inconvenient as a wrinkle. And the smile on her face was the particular variety that airlines spent years training into their staff, warm on the surface, perfectly calibrated, and carrying underneath it a pressure that had nothing to do with warmth at all. Behind Brittany, slightly to the left and already settling his weight forward as though the question of who owned this space had been decided before anyone asked it, stood a man in his mid-50s wearing a gray suit that had cost more than most people's rent. Salt and pepper hair, a designer briefcase that he was already lowering to the floor beside Seat 2A with the casual confidence of someone who had spent 5 decades moving through the world and finding it arranged for his convenience, and he had not once looked directly at Simone. His name, she would learn, was Derek Colton. 20 pairs of eyes shifted in the quiet cabin, some overtly, and some through the calculated indirection of people who wanted to see without being seen to see. And in the window seat of 1A, an older woman with silver hair and a book open in her lap did not pretend to look away. She simply watched, her expression revealing nothing, her attention complete. At the entrance to the galley, a younger flight attendant named Elena Vasquez stood with a tray half prepared in her hands, and the moment she registered what was happening, her jaw tightened, and she did not move, and the stillness of her not moving was the kind that comes from understanding the situation completely, and being uncertain in that particular instant what could be done about it. Simone picked up her boarding pass from the armrest where she had placed it when she sat down, and she held it up with the measured patience of someone presenting evidence rather than making a plea. Seat 2. A confirmed the date of booking 6 weeks prior. Her name printed in clean black letters, and she looked at Brittany Hale and said in a voice that was steady and even and gave away absolutely nothing of what was turning over in her chest. "This is my seat. I reserved it specifically." Brittany's smile made a minor adjustment, the way a camera lens shifts focus on a subject without moving the frame, and she said, "I completely understand, and I apologize for any confusion, but we do have an operational discretion policy for our preferred guests, and Mr. Colton has priority status with the airline," and the way she said priority status was the way certain people say certain things, with the implication that the phrase itself ought to be enough that the words carried a self-evident authority that reasonable people would simply accept without asking where it came from. Derek Colton checked his watch. He did it without looking up, without acknowledging that he was standing 2 feet from a woman whose seat he was preparing to occupy, without any gesture toward the human being, whose presence he had apparently decided was a logistical detail rather than a person. And the small sound of the watch clasp settling back against his wrist was somehow louder than it had any right to be in the silence of the cabin. From 6C, several rows behind the first-class divider, a young man named Noah Park looked up from his phone, and his expression shifted in the way that expressions shift. When recognition arrives, he knew exactly who the woman in the navy dress was, and he sat very still for a moment, and then he turned his phone over in his hands and said nothing. Judith Calloway. In one, set her book down in her lap, spine up to hold her place. There was a particular kind of recognition that Simone Carter had developed over 42 years of moving through the world in her skin through boardrooms and venture capital meetings and country club networking events and corporate retreats at exclusive resorts. And it was not bitterness, and it was not even anger exactly. It was more like a precise clinical awareness that arrived the way a doctor reads an X-ray, identifying the structure of what she was looking at without needing it explained to her. She knew what this was. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at her and decided in the space of a glance that she was in the wrong place, had decided it not based on anything she had done or said or any evidence they could point to, but simply based on the fact of her presence in a space that their assumptions had already assigned to someone else, and the thing her grandmother Ida had told her. In the kitchen of their Baltimore row house, with her hands flat on the table and her voice carrying the weight of long experience, was that in this world they will try to erase you twice, once for being black and once for being a woman, and your job is to stay undeniably present without raising your voice. And Simone had carried that with her through every room that had ever made her feel like a question mark, and she carried it now. What specific policy, she said, and her voice was the same, measured, not combative. Genuinely inquiring authorizes the reassignment of a confirmed first-class booking to accommodate another passenger. Brittany's smile held, but something behind it flickered the way a light flickers when the voltage drops for just a fraction of a second, and she said, "It's our operational discretion protocol for elite status members, ma'am," and the phrase came out with the same practiced smoothness as before. But this time it landed differently, because now it was being asked to answer a specific question, and it wasn't quite doing the job. And that policy is documented where Simone asked, and her tone was the tone of someone who asks questions for a living, because she was someone who asked questions for a living, and the question hung in the air of the first-class cabin, with a clarity that several nearby passengers registered visibly. A young professional 2 rows behind the first-class divider shifted in his seat, and across the aisle a woman set down her magazine. Brittany said, "It's an internal protocol, ma'am." And then, with the slight acceleration of someone moving past a difficult moment, "If you'll just follow me to premium economy, we really do need to prepare the cabin for departure." It was at this point that Derek Colton spoke not to Simone and not quite to Brittany, but to the general atmosphere of the cabin in the way that people speak when they have decided that the conversation is essentially already over. And what he said was, "I've got connections waiting in Singapore, and I really do need to be rested for this flight." And the word connections arrived with the particular weight of a man who had used it many times and found that it usually worked. And there was something underneath it, not a word, just an implication that suggested the inconvenience here was Simone's presence rather than his entitlement. Noah Park's phone tilted upward by approximately 15 degrees. Simone thought about the contract. She thought about the 9 a.m. meeting in Seattle, about Marcus Webb's message that morning. "Whitfield's team is ready. Everything's in place. This is the one," and she thought about the $700 million that represented 3 years of development and 200 people at Apex Digital whose futures were wound up in it. And she thought about the fact that the company about to sign that contract was the same company whose employee was currently standing over her asking her to relocate because a man in a gray suit wanted her seat. She thought about what her grandmother had said. She picked up her tablet and her purse with deliberate, unhurried movements. Not the speed of someone accommodating, not the speed of someone retreating, but the speed of someone making a choice on their own terms. And she stood, and she was taller than Brittany had perhaps expected, and her posture was the kind that comes not from performance, but from having decided a long time ago that she would not make herself smaller in rooms that tried to compress her. "Thank you for your patience," Brittany said, and the relief in her voice was immediate and involuntary, and telling she had expected a scene, had prepared for one, and the compliance surprised her in a way she couldn't quite conceal. As Simone moved past Derek Colton, she was close enough to catch the specific expensive cologne of a man who had spent his entire life in spaces that opened for him automatically, and he did not look up from the seat he was already settling into, pressing the call button for service with the ease of a person who had never once questioned whether the service would come. Judith Calloway in 1A did not look away. Elena Vasquez, At the galley entrance, watched Simone walk past with an expression that was careful and pained in equal measure, and her hands tightened slightly around the tray she was holding, and she did not speak. The walk from first class to premium economy was not a long one in terms of physical distance, perhaps 40 feet through the business class cabin and past the second galley. But there is a kind of distance that has nothing to do with feet. And Simone felt every inch of it in the shift of the light overhead, slightly harsher now, and in the closer arrangement of the seats, and in the particular silence of the passengers she passed who had seen enough to understand what was happening, and had chosen, as people in these situations generally choose, not to involve themselves. She was shown to 5C by Brittany, who gestured toward the aisle seat with a smile that had been rebuilt from scratch since the first-class cabin, and was now performing a different kind of warmth. The warmth of resolution of a problem successfully managed, and who said, "We'll have your pre-departure beverage brought right over," as though the issue had been a question of hospitality rather than principle, as though what Simone needed was a drink rather than the seat that was legally and contractually hers. Simone sat down without responding. She did not immediately reach for her phone, did not begin composing messages or reviewing notes or doing any of the productive things that her instinct for efficiency usually demanded of empty moments, because sometimes the right thing is to sit with the full weight of what has happened and let it settle accurately before deciding what to do with it. And this was one of those times, and she sat with her hands in her lap and felt the seat beneath her, and the difference in the lighting above her, and the closer proximity of the seat in front of her, and let all of it register completely. Around her, the premium economy cabin carried on with the ordinary business of pre-departure passengers, stuffing bags into overhead bins, settling headphones over their ears, scrolling through phones with the distracted focus of people killing time. And 2 rows ahead, a mother was arranging a blanket over her daughter's lap, and did not look up when Simone sat down, though her posture shifted slightly in the way that people's postures shift when they are aware of something without wanting to acknowledge that awareness. A businessman across the aisle glanced at her expensive watch, the slightly rumpled appearance of someone at the end of a long week, and his glance lasted 1 second too long before he looked back at his laptop with the careful speed of someone who has decided not to see something they have already seen. Elena Vasquez appeared beside her seat, and she was carrying an amenity kit that was not quite first-class quality and not quite standard premium economy either, and she placed it on Simone's tray table with a care that was more deliberate than the action required, and she said very quietly, "I'm sorry about the adjustment," and the word adjustment in her mouth carried the weight of everything. She was not able to say more directly, and her eyes said the rest. "This is not right. I know it is not right. I am sorry that I did not say so when it would have mattered." "Thank you, Elena," Simone said. And she meant it, and Elena nodded once and moved away. From 6C directly behind her, Noah Park had repositioned himself slightly in his seat, not in a way that would attract attention, but enough that his phone was at an angle that captured the premium economy cabin and the gap in the first-class curtain beyond it, and he had not yet said anything to anyone, though. His thumbs moved across his screen with quiet purpose. Simone reached for her phone and opened her secure messages, and the notification from Marcus Webb was exactly what she had expected it to be. Contract edits final, all clean. Whitfield's team confirmed for 9 a.m. This is the biggest one call when you land, and she read it twice, and then sat for a moment looking at the words. The biggest one, and thinking about what they meant in the context of the last 20 minutes. $700 million. 3 years of work. A contract that would make Apex Digital the digital backbone of one of the largest airlines in the country. Every ticket, every crew schedule, every baggage route, every financial reconciliation, every customer interaction, all of it running through infrastructure that she had spent 14 years building from a 2-person operation in a Baltimore office park into something that now touched the daily operations of 4 major carriers and Meridian Airways. The company whose employee had just asked her to gather her things and stand up, whose regional VP was currently reclining in her seat, was about to sign the largest extension of that infrastructure in the company's history. She looked through the gap in the first-class curtain. Brittany Hale was standing beside seat 2A with a fresh champagne flute, and Derek Colton was reclining with the particular boneless ease of a man who has never had a reason to sit up straight when he doesn't feel like it. And he was saying something that made Brittany laugh, a real laugh. Not the professional variety, the kind that happens when the mask comes down and the champagne caught the amber light of the cabin and held it. Simone's grandmother Ida used to sit at the kitchen table in Baltimore on Sunday mornings, with her coffee going cold beside her, and say things that sounded like ordinary observations, but turned out to be the kind of lessons that took years to fully understand. And one of the things she used to say was, "Baby, sometimes power is quiet. Sometimes it's just knowing which switch controls the lights." And at the time, Simone had thought she was talking about patience, about endurance, about surviving systems that weren't built for you, but she understood now, sitting in 5C with her thumb hovering over the operations application on her phone, that her grandmother had meant something more specific than that. She opened the application. The system dashboard loaded with the familiar architecture she knew better than most people know their own homes. The Apex Digital Operations Interface, designed during the contract preparation phase to give her team diagnostic access to Meridian's integrated infrastructure, a legitimate tool built for legitimate purposes, designed to ensure the integrity of the handoff when the full contract activated, and equipped with a protocol verification alpha that could initiate a full system integrity check requiring executive-level authentication before any operational approvals could proceed. It was by every technical definition exactly what it claimed to be, a security measure. She looked at the first-class curtain one more time. She thought about every other woman who had sat in a seat like this one. Not this particular seat. Not this particular cabin, but this particular position, this particular moment of having been told to move, to accommodate, to accept the polite fiction that the inconvenience was operational rather than personal. And she thought about how many of them had had no switch to reach, for no lever to pull, no way to make the room feel the weight of what it had done. The aircraft began to push back from the gate. Simone pressed the confirmation sequence 12 characters, 3 fields, her personal authorization code, and then she set her phone face down on the tray table and looked out the window at the ground crew moving in the orange terminal lights below. And her expression was the same as it had been when she boarded, calm, precise, and giving away nothing at all. 14 years ago, Simone Carter had left a senior developer position at a tech firm in D.C. with a business plan printed on 11 sheets of paper, a savings account that would last approximately 8 months if she was careful, and an idea that most of the venture capitalists she pitched in that first year told her was either too narrow or too ambitious, depending on which partner was in the room. The idea was this. The airline industry ran on digital infrastructure that had been built in pieces over decades by different vendors for different purposes, and the result was a patchwork of incompatible systems that cost airlines billions annually in inefficiency, errors, and lost data. And what the industry needed was not another piece of software, but a complete architectural integration. A single, unified digital backbone that could speak every language the existing systems already spoke, while adding the intelligence layer that connected them into something coherent. She had seen it from the inside at her previous job, where she had spent 2 years trying to get 3 incompatible scheduling platforms to share data without manual intervention. And she had understood not just the technical problem, but the economic one. Every hour of delay caused by a system that couldn't talk to another system, every misrouted bag, every crew scheduling error, every rebooking that took 20 minutes instead of 2. All of it had a dollar figure attached. And the dollar figures, when you added them up across an operation the size of a major airline, were staggering. Apex Digital Solutions, launched in a Baltimore office park with Simone and one engineer, a man named Devin Briggs, who had worked with her at the previous company and who had said yes to a 30% salary cut because he believed in the architecture and because Simone had a particular quality when she explained her vision, a combination of technical precision and absolute confidence that made the improbable sound not just possible but inevitable. Within 3 years, they had their first airline client, a regional carrier that was hemorrhaging money on operations and had tried everything else. Within 6 years, they had 4 clients, 40 employees, and a reputation in the industry for doing exactly what they said they would do. Within 10 years, Meridian Airways had come knocking. Meridian was the 3rd largest domestic carrier in the country, with 280 daily departures, 40,000 employees, and a digital infrastructure that had been built, added to patched, rebuilt in sections, and expanded again over 30 years, until it resembled nothing so much as a city that had grown without a plan, functional, in a manner of speaking, expensive to maintain, and profoundly vulnerable to the kinds of cascading failures that happened when one system's unexpected behavior rippled through 10 others that depended on it. The contract that was sitting in a conference room in Seattle waiting for signatures at 9 a.m. Tomorrow was the culmination of 3 years of preparation mapping Meridian's entire digital architecture, identifying the integration points, designing the migration pathway, stress testing the new infrastructure against every failure scenario. Apex's engineering team could imagine and building into the system a set of security protocols that would protect the integrity of the transition during the handoff period. Those protocols included by mutual agreement with Meridian's CDO provision that allowed Apex to initiate a full system verification requiring executive-level authentication for any operational approvals in the event of a detected integrity concern during the pre-activation period. The provision had been written by Meridian's own legal team. Simone had not designed it as a weapon, and she was not using it as one. Now she was using it as precisely what it was, a security measure activated in response to a situation she had classified with technical accuracy as a potential integrity concern. Specifically, the concern that the company she was about to hand operational control of its digital infrastructure to was one that made decisions based on personal preference rather than stated policy, that fabricated protocols when convenient and abandoned them when inconvenient, and that had just demonstrated in 40 feet of cabin aisle exactly the kind of institutional decision-making that could compromise the integrity of any partnership. The plane had lifted from the runway, now banking west over the city, the ground falling away into a constellation of lights below. Simone looked out the window and thought about the 200 people at Apex Digital who showed up every morning and built things that worked, and she thought about the communities that the Meridian integration would serve the passengers in smaller markets who would finally get on-time arrivals instead of cascading delays. The crew members who would stop getting scheduling notices at midnight for 5 a.m. departures. And she thought about what it meant to build something real in the world and then be told by the world to sit somewhere else. She had not built Apex Digital to be accommodated. She had built it to be necessary. Marcus Webb's message glowed on her locked screen, patient and unread. This is the biggest one. Yes, she thought. It was. The authorization sequence for Protocol Verification Alpha required 12 characters in a specific pattern, divided across 3 input fields, and it had been designed by Apex's security architecture team to be impossible to trigger. Accidentally, each field required a deliberate entry, and the final confirmation required her personal biometric authentication, and the whole process took approximately 45 seconds from opening the application to pressing the final confirm button, which was enough time to change her mind several times if she was going to. She did not change her mind. The confirmation screen cleared, replaced by a single line of text. Verification initiated. Authorization code SC-A-Alpha-4471. Notification sent to Apex Ops Team, Alpha, and Meridian Integration Oversight. She set the phone face down on the tray table. The cabin around her was quiet, in the way that late-night flights are quiet. The white noise of the engines, a constant presence beneath everything. The overhead lights dimmed to a gentle amber. The particular stillness of 212 people suspended together, 40,000 feet above the earth, with nowhere else to be for the next 5 hours. 3,000 miles east in a glass and steel operations center outside Boston that ran 24 hours a day and processed approximately 4 million data transactions per hour. Raymond Cole was sitting at his desk reviewing the overnight crew projections for the next day's departures when his monitoring dashboard, a screen he had looked at approximately 800 times in the past year, and that had displayed in all that time nothing more alarming than the occasional yellow flag for a late-arriving aircraft went from all green to a cascading pattern of yellow alerts with 3 critical systems showing red. He stared at it for 3 full seconds before he moved. "Taylor," he said to the night shift systems administrator across the room, and his voice had that very specific quality that operations people recognize immediately. Not panic, not yet, but the absolute focused attention of someone who has just seen something they do not yet understand. "What am I looking at?" Taylor Morrison was already at her keyboard, her fingers moving across it with the speed of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of scenario, and she pulled up the system architecture map and the alert log simultaneously, and what she saw made her stop moving for 1 second before she resumed with greater urgency. "It's a verification protocol," she said, "coming through the Nexus, coming through the Apex integration layer, the pre-activation infrastructure," and the slight correction in her terminology was important because what she was realizing as she spoke was that the system doing this was not a Meridian system. It was an Apex system operating through access that had been granted as part of the contract preparation, and that meant there was nothing in Meridian's own toolkit that could simply override it. "We don't have access to that architecture," she said. "It's proprietary to Apex." Raymond Cole was already reaching for his phone. "Get me Whitfield," he said. Back aboard Flight 447, still climbing through 28,000 feet over the Pennsylvania darkness, Simone Carter had set her phone face down and was reviewing the contract revision notes that Marcus Webb had sent through that afternoon, the final language on the data governance clauses, the performance benchmarks, the liability provisions, with the focused attention of someone who had a meeting in the morning and wanted to be prepared for it. Her posture had not changed. Her expression had not changed. In the galley at the forward end of Premium Economy, Elena Vasquez was checking the supply inventory for the beverage service when a notification appeared on her crew tablet. A brief, technical-looking alert she didn't fully understand. Something about a system verification process affecting ground operations. And she frowned at it, and then looked up through the curtain gap toward first class, where Brittany was leaning against the galley counter with the easy posture of someone who had dealt with a difficult passenger and moved on and then back down at the tablet in her hands, and the frown deepened. In 6C, Noah Park had just gotten a push notification from an aviation news aggregator. He followed, "Developing Meridian Airways reporting network-wide system verification delay scope. Unknown ground operations affected at multiple hubs." He looked at the notification. He looked at the back of the seat in front of him, through which 40 feet forward and behind a curtain a woman sat alone in Premium Economy with her face turned toward the window. His thumbs began to move. At JFK Terminal 7, the 9:47 p.m. Meridian flight to Miami had finished boarding 12 minutes ago and was supposed to be pushing back from the gate, and instead the gate agent was standing at her podium with the fixed smile of someone reading from a script she had just been handed and telling the passengers visible through the window that there was a brief system verification delay and they should expect an update shortly, and the passengers visible through the window were not reassured by this because the departure board above the podium had just changed their flight status from on time to security verification hold, a status designation that none of them had ever seen before, and several of them were already on their phones. At Chicago, O'Hare, a transatlantic flight to London that had been fully boarded for 20 minutes, 412 passengers, first meal service prepped crew at stations received a ground ops communication that halted its pushback and required it to return to the gate for manual processing. And the captain made an announcement that was as composed as announcements could be under the circumstances. But the phrase manual processing in the context of a transatlantic departure carried an unmistakable undertone that the business travelers in first class who had connections and meetings, and the particular impatience of people accustomed to schedules working, did not receive well. At Dallas-Fort Worth, the crew scheduling system, which processed approximately 3,400 daily assignments for Meridian's flight operations, froze mid-cycle. leaving 47 crew assignments in an incomplete state that required human supervisors to manually verify and confirm before any of the affected flights could legally depart, and the overnight operations supervisor called in 2 additional staff members and then called her manager at home. The pattern was the same at every hub, not a crash, not a failure, not the kind of event that triggered emergency protocols or safety concerns. Everything safety-related was on entirely separate infrastructure that the verification protocol did not touch, but a controlled, total pause in the commercial operations layer, like a hand placed flat against a revolving door, not breaking anything, just stopping the movement. Every Meridian departure in the country showed security verification hold. The social media response began approximately 4 minutes after the first status changes appeared on the flight. Tracking apps first confused posts, then frustrated ones, then the specific kind of viral acceleration that happens when a large number of people are inconvenienced simultaneously and have nothing to do but look at their phones. And within 20 minutes, there were 2 competing hashtags. And within 30 minutes, the aviation news outlets were running developing story banners. None of the posts yet knew why. In business class on Flight 447, a passenger named Gregory Marsh had been watching the sequence of events since the departure gate with the specific fascination of someone who had worked in corporate communications for 20 years and recognized a crisis developing in real time. And he was on his phone composing a message to a friend at a competing airline when he felt the slight, almost imperceptible change in the cabin atmosphere, a shift in the movement of the flight attendants, something too quick and purposeful for a beverage run, and he looked up. Brittany Hale was standing in the first-class galley with her crew tablet in one hand and her personal phone in the other, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone reading bad news and trying to maintain a neutral expression while reading it, and not entirely succeeding. Derek Colton had his noise-canceling headphones on and was watching something on his personal screen, and was entirely insulated from all of it, which was, in its own way, a kind of portrait. Judith Calloway in 1A had returned to her book, but was reading the same paragraph for the 4th time because her own phone had vibrated twice in the last 5 minutes with messages she had not yet opened, and she had a fairly specific intuition about what they contained, and she was choosing to let the situation develop at its own pace before she involved herself. In 6C, Noah Park had pulled up every real-time flight tracker available, and confirmed what he already suspected: every single Meridian departure in the country, from the smallest regional connector to the transatlantic heavies at the major hubs, was showing the same hold status. And the timestamp on the first alert correlated precisely with the wheels-up time of Flight 447. And the woman who had been walked out of first class was the CEO of the company whose infrastructure had just paused an entire airline. He opened a new thread on his phone and began typing with the careful precision of someone who understood they were documenting something that mattered. Simone's phone had lit up twice with calls from an unknown number she recognized as Grant Whitfield's executive line. She had seen it on the contract documentation, often enough to know it on sight, and once with a message from Marcus Webb that said simply, "Seeing the alerts. Meridian systems down nationwide. You on this?" And she had read all of them and responded to none of them and set the phone face down again and returned to the contract notes. Let them wait. She thought the same way she had been asked to wait. Let them feel for a little while what it was like to have a protocol cited against you with no recourse and no one in the room who seemed to think that warranted any particular concern. The engines held their steady roar. The plane moved west through the dark. Captain James Okafor had been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years, and in that time he had encountered most of the situations that aviation manuals document, and a reasonable number that they don't. And he had developed the particular quality that good captains develop over long careers. A calm that was not the absence of concern, but the management of it. The ability to receive information that would alarm most people and respond to it with the kind of measured deliberateness that makes everyone around you feel that things are, if not exactly fine, at least navigable. The priority communication from Grant Whitfield's office had arrived on his cockpit communications display 12 minutes into the cruise phase, and it was not the kind of message he usually received from airline CEOs, and he read it twice before he responded. Captain Okafor, this is Grant Whitfield, CEO of Meridian Airways. We have a priority situation requiring your direct involvement. Passenger Simone Carter, currently in premium economy seat 5C on your aircraft, has initiated a security protocol affecting our entire network. Background. Ms. Carter is CEO of Apex Digital Solutions, our technology integration partner. Our records show she was originally confirmed in first-class seat 2A. I need you to understand the full gravity of what's happening here. Approach Ms. Carter with complete courtesy and respect. This is a matter of significant operational importance to the airline. I need her contacted and her situation addressed. Authorization. Whitfield-exec-1. He read it a second time, slowly. Then he said to his first officer, Marcus Dryden, pull up the original booking for passenger Carter in seat 5C. Dryden ran the query and read back the result. Simone Carter. Seat 2A. Booked 6 weeks ago. Confirmed. Paid in full. Notes show she was relocated to 5C approximately 40 minutes ago at the request of Flight Attendant Hale for... He paused, and something in his voice shifted slightly. Preferred passenger accommodation for a Mr. Derek Colton. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Mr. Colton's original seat assignment, he said. Business class 8C. The cockpit was quiet except for the steady white noise of the engines and the soft chatter of the navigation instruments. All right, Okafor said. Take the controls. He unbuckled his harness, checked his uniform jacket, and walked out of the cockpit with the purposeful stride of a man who had decided exactly what he was going to do. And the passengers he passed in business class registered his presence with the mixture of attention and anxiety that people always feel when they see a pilot walking through the cabin. It always meant something, even when that something was minor, and the something this time was not minor, and several of them watched him continue past the business class curtain and into premium economy, with the focused attention of people who suspected they were about to watch something significant unfold. He found 5C without difficulty. Simone Carter was sitting with her tablet open and her posture straight, and her expression composed, and when she looked up at him there was no surprise in her face. Not because she had expected this exactly, but because she had been navigating unexpected developments for 22 years, and she had learned to receive new information without broadcasting her reaction to it. Ms. Carter, he said, and his voice was formal in the way that the best professional courtesy is formal, not distancing but precise, offering her the full dignity of her name and title. I'm Captain Okafor. I wonder if I might speak with you for a moment. Of course, Captain, she said, and set her tablet face down on the tray table. He crouched slightly beside her seat, not wanting to stand over her, understanding the geometry of power in that position, and he said quietly enough that only she could hear him clearly. I've received a communication from our CEO's office, and I've also pulled your original booking. You were confirmed in seat 2, 6 weeks ago, paid in full. That's correct, she said. Can you tell me what happened? She told him simply, and without emphasis, the flight attendant, the phrase preferred passenger protocol, the man in the gray suit who had been present before she was asked to move the request that she relocate to premium economy. Okafor listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, I've been instructed to return you to your original seat immediately, and I want to do that. But I want to ask you first, will that address your immediate concern? It was a good question, and she recognized it as such because it acknowledged that the seat was not the whole problem. That the seat was the visible surface of something that went deeper, and that returning her to 2A would resolve the symptom without necessarily addressing what had produced it. It would be a start, Captain, she said. He nodded once, a small, deliberate acknowledgement that understood everything she had and hadn't said in those 6 words. Then if you'll follow me, he said, and stood. The walk back through the aircraft was 40 feet in the same direction Simone had walked an hour earlier, but it was 40 feet of an entirely different kind, and she felt the difference in the way that you feel the difference between walking out of a room and walking back into it with the room changed. Noah Park looked up from his phone as she passed through premium economy, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone watching something they had hoped would happen, and were not entirely certain would a quiet relief that carried its own kind of intensity. And his phone was raised now with no attempt at concealment, because what was happening was the kind of thing that should be documented, and he had already decided to document it. 2 rows behind him, Gregory Marsh had abandoned any pretense of doing something else, and was watching with the complete attention of someone for whom this had become the most important event in his vicinity. They moved through business class Okafor slightly ahead, his uniform carrying the authority that uniforms carry when the person inside them has decided to use it, and Simone a half step behind her posture, unchanged from the moment she had boarded, straight unhurried present, and the passengers they passed registered the procession with the particular alertness of people who understand that something significant is in motion even when they don't yet know all of it. They reached the first-class curtain. Brittany Hale saw them coming, and Simone watched the smile on Brittany's face do the thing it had done twice before, that fractional rearrangement, that shift in the voltage behind the expression. But this time, the shift was more substantial because the captain was there, and the captain's posture communicated something that made the smile difficult to maintain. Brittany Okafor said, and his tone was the tone of someone who has made a decision and is communicating it, not requesting feedback. Ms. Carter is returning to her original seat in 2A. Please assist Mr. Colton with relocating to an available seat in business class. Brittany opened her mouth. Captain? She began, and the word carried the beginning of a protocol justification, the beginning of the phrase that had been used to produce this situation in the first place. This comes directly from CEO. Whitfield Okafor said, and his voice had not changed in volume or in sharpness, but it had changed in some quality of finality that made the interruption unnecessary, and it is not a request. In seat 2. Derek Colton became aware that something was happening in the way that people become aware of things when they are wearing noise-canceling headphones, and the visual field shifts. He pulled the headphones down and looked up with the irritation of a man interrupted mid-film, and what he saw was the captain standing beside his seat and a woman he recognized in the aisle behind him. His expression moved through confusion and irritation and something that was trying to be authority and not quite making it. What exactly is going on? He said. Mr. Colton Okafor said there has been a misunderstanding regarding the seat assignment. Miss Carter was originally confirmed in 2A, and I need to ask you to relocate. I'm a regional VP with elite status, Derek said. And he said it the way people say things they have found to be effective, with the implicit expectation that the phrase would do the work it had always done, and Brittany already explained the protocol. This directive, Okafor said, with a patience that had nothing passive in it, comes from CEO Whitfield personally. There is a larger operational situation involved. This is not a discretion question. The name Whitfield produced a visible recalculation in Derek's expression. The CEO was above everyone else in the organizational structure Derek inhabited, and even entitled men understood when they had run out of runway. He looked at Simone. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her during any of the previous exchanges, actually looked, registering her face and her posture and the specific quality of the composed patience she was directing at him. And she watched the arithmetic happen behind his eyes, the belated addition of things that should have been obvious to him 40 feet back. Who exactly are you? He said. And the question arrived differently this time, stripped of the dismissive register it would have carried, before carrying instead something that was adjacent to the beginning of understanding. Simone said nothing. She simply looked at him with the steady, unperturbed attention of someone who had been asked to wait and had waited, and was now done waiting, and was prepared to be patient for exactly as long as it took. Elena Vasquez appeared at the precise right moment. How much of that timing was instinct, and how much was professional training, was impossible to say. But she materialized beside Derek with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been watching and was ready, and she said, Mr. Colton, we have a seat prepared for you in business class. Let me help you with your things. And her voice carried a warmth that was real rather than performed the warmth of someone offering a man a way to exit a situation without completely losing face. And Derek, after another second of suspended calculation, stood. He gathered his briefcase. He moved toward business class without speaking again, and as he passed Simone, their eyes did not meet, and the absence of that meeting said everything it needed to say. Simone sat down in seat 2A. It felt in the particular way that reclaimed things feel like something more than a seat. Judith Calloway in 1A had lowered her book. She looked at Simone with the calm, direct appraisal of someone who had been watching for a long time and had just seen the thing she was watching arrive, and then she gave a small nod, not congratulatory, not celebratory, but the nod of one professional recognizing another, and Simone received it with the same quiet economy. The champagne arrived in a crystal flute. She asked for water. The confrontation, when it came, arrived the way confrontations do, when a person has been given enough time to replace humiliation with the story of humiliation that makes it someone else's fault. Derek Colton pushed back through the business class curtain approximately 15 minutes after his relocation, his face carrying the flushed, specific quality of a man who had spent those 15 minutes on his phone with someone who had told him he had options, or possibly the face of a man who had spent those 15 minutes building a version of events in which he was the aggrieved party. He stopped beside seat 2A. He stood over her in the exact geometric relationship that Brittany had stood over her 2 hours earlier, and the inversion was so precise that it might have been designed, and several passengers in the first-class cabin who had been present for both moments felt it land. "Do you understand what you've done?" he said, and his voice was louder than it needed to be, not shouting, but the deliberate elevation of someone who has decided that volume confers authority. Every Meridian flight in the country is grounded right now because of whatever stunt you just pulled. Thousands of people are sitting in terminals because you couldn't handle a seat reassignment like an adult. He kept going. Sabotage, he said, and hostage. And do you have any idea who I have relationships with at this company? And the words accumulated in the air of the first-class cabin with the particular weight of a person constructing the largest possible version of their complaint while the person they were complaining at remained absolutely, unmovably still. Simone closed her tablet. She looked at him with an expression that was neutral in the way that very specifically focused attention can appear neutral to someone who isn't reading it carefully. "Mr. Colton," she said, and her voice was the same as it had been when she had held up her boarding pass and said, "This is my seat." Even unhurried, making no concession to his volume. "I'm curious about the protocol that was cited when I was asked to leave this seat. The operational discretion policy for preferred guests." She paused for exactly one beat. "I'd still like to see that document. Can you tell me where it's filed?" The silence that followed that question was a different quality of silence than the previous silences in this cabin, because everyone present understood that there was no document, that there had never been a document, that the protocol had been a phrase constructed on the spot to accomplish a specific outcome. And Derek Colton understood it most clearly of all, and the understanding moved across his face like weather. "This isn't about a document," he said, and his voice had lost some of its carrying power. "This is about you retaliating against an entire airline." "Was it a simple reassignment?" Simone said, and there was nothing hostile in her tone. Nothing that could be reasonably characterized as an attack, just a question arriving with very precise clarity. "When you set your briefcase down in my seat before anyone had asked me to move. Did it occur to you at any point to wonder why the woman already sitting there was being asked to leave?" The question was the kind that doesn't need an answer, because the answer is already visible in the room. Brittany Hale had appeared at the edge of the galley with the rigid posture of someone who has just realized that the phrase she invented 2 hours ago is being examined in public, and her expression was the expression of a person experiencing the particular discomfort of being held without being named to account. "This is about race," Derek said, changing directions. "You're making it about race." "I'm asking about a policy," Simone said. If that policy was applied consistently and fairly, you should be able to show me where it's documented. That's all I'm asking." The first-class cabin had gone completely still. Nobody was pretending to read. Nobody was pretending to look at a screen. Every person in the cabin was watching with the full, undivided attention of people who understand they are witnessing something that matters, and the watching was its own form of consequence, the room refusing collectively to look away. Captain Okafor appeared at the front of the first-class cabin. He did not say anything elaborate. He looked at Derek Colton with the steady authoritative attention of a man who has absolute jurisdiction over the space he is standing in, and Derek, who had already run out of protocols and executives and volume and was now running out of audience, looked from Okafor to Simone and back again, and the last of the performance collapsed. "This isn't over," he said to Simone quietly enough that it was almost private, and there was something in his voice now that was closer to confusion than threat. The confusion of a man who had moved through 40 years of professional life with certain assumptions about how things worked, and was standing now in the ruins of one of them. "You're right about that," Simone said, and her voice was quiet too, and there was no triumph in it, and no anger, just the plain acknowledgement of a fact that both of them now understood. It's just beginning. He turned and went back through the curtain. From one, a Judith Calloway said not to anyone in particular, but in a voice that carried clearly in the silence of the cabin, remarkable. Simone reopened her tablet. Captain Okafor arranged for her to use the forward phone booth, a small, semi-enclosed space near the first-class galley that offered enough acoustic privacy for a call of this nature, and he did it without being asked, with the quiet efficiency of a man who was managing a situation with more dimensions than he had initially anticipated, and was bringing the full weight of his professionalism to each of them. "Mr. Whitfield," Simone said when the call connected. "Ms. Carter." Grant Whitfield's voice was the voice of a 58-year-old man who had managed major crises before and knew what they felt like from the inside, and what this one felt like, she could tell, was different from the usual variety. Not a plain mechanical or a weather disruption or a fuel spill or a labor action, but something that involved a woman in a premium economy seat and the largest technology contract in the company's history, and a security protocol that was, with every passing minute, costing the airline approximately $700,000 in delayed operations, and the particular flavor of this crisis was one he did not yet fully have language for. "I understand there's been an incident on your flight." "There has been," she said. "I'd like to discuss it with you. I'd very much like to do the same. I want to start by saying that what was described to me, the displacement from your confirmed seat, the protocol that was cited, is not consistent with our policies, and I apologize for it directly." "I appreciate that," she said. "I'd like to talk about 3 things." There was a slight pause. "Of course. First, the immediate situation. I've initiated a verification protocol on the Apex integration layer, and I'm prepared to authorize a gradual system restoration as soon as we've established a framework for the other 2 items. Miss Carter, I want to be transparent with you. The current hold is affecting thousands of passengers, and the financial impact is significant." "I understand that," she said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was not moved either. "And I trust you can also understand that being told to gather my things and vacate my confirmed seat for a man who had not yet been asked to wait is an impact of a different kind, and one that has happened to people without the leverage I happen to have, with considerably less concern from this airline." A longer pause. "That's fair," Whitfield said, and the 2 words arrived with enough weight behind them to suggest that they were genuine rather than corporate. Second, she continued, "I want a substantial revision to tomorrow's contract. Not an addendum core language. I want accountability benchmarks built into the partnership structure, quarterly reporting on how service discretion policies are applied across demographic categories, with results reviewed by an independent third-party auditor. Meridian will not simply be receiving technology from Apex. Meridian will be committing as a condition of this partnership to the kind of operational integrity that the technology is designed to support." The pause before Whitfield's response was longer. This time, the pause of a man doing calculations that involved board approvals and legal reviews and operational changes. And also she thought the pause of a man who had just been told the truth about something and was deciding how to receive it. That's unconventional language for a technology integration contract, he said. So is activating a security protocol over a seat assignment, she said. And yet here we are. She heard him exhale. What's the third item? A full demographic audit of Meridian's passenger displacement and service delivery patterns over the past 5 years. Conducted externally. Results made available, not buried in an internal review that produces a memo no one reads but made available in a form that creates genuine accountability. You're describing a comprehensive public review of our customer service operations. I'm describing the thing that tells you whether what happened to me tonight is an exception or a pattern, she said. And I think you already know which one it is. The silence that followed had a different quality, not the calculating silence of someone running numbers, but something closer to recognition, the silence of someone who has been handed an accurate mirror and is looking at it. What about individual accountability? Whitfield said finally. The staff involved. I'm not asking for terminations, she said. Firing specific people creates the appearance of accountability without the substance of it. The flight attendant and the regional VP were operating inside a culture that made their choices feel safe and normal. Removing them doesn't address what produced them. Another pause. That's a more generous position than I expected. It's not generosity, she said. It's the only approach that produces anything that lasts. She could hear him writing. One more thing, she said. Captain Okafor handled this with exceptional professionalism and integrity. I want that formally recognized. Noted and agreed, Whitfield said without hesitation. Then I'll authorize a phased system restoration beginning as soon as we conclude this call, and I'll see your team in Seattle at 9 a.m., Ms. Carter, Whitfield said, and his voice had shifted into something less corporate and more direct. I want to say something outside the framework of this negotiation. Go ahead. What happened to you tonight should not have happened. Not the logistics of it and not the assumption behind it. I've been in this industry for 30 years, and what your company has built is genuinely remarkable, and the fact that the people responsible for the situation tonight apparently never considered who they were dealing with is... He paused. It says something about what we've normalized, and it's something I intend to take seriously. Simone was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. That's what I'm counting on. She returned to 2A to find a folded note on the armrest. Not a printed card, not something produced by a crew member, but a piece of notepaper with handwriting that was deliberate and slightly formal. The handwriting of a generation that was taught that how you wrote said something about who you were. Ms. Carter, I've been in seat 1A since boarding. I've observed everything. I'm a board member of this airline, and I believe we have more to discuss than a technology contract. What happened tonight is not about one flight or 2 employees. It's about what institutions allow when they think no one important enough is watching. I'd like to speak with you before we land. J. Calloway. Simone looked up. Judith Calloway was already looking at her, had been waiting perhaps for the look, and when their eyes met, she gave a small, precise tilt of her head that was an invitation without being a demand. Simone moved to the empty seat across the aisle. Judith Calloway, the older woman said, extending her hand, and her grip was firm and direct. I've been aware of Apex Digital for several years. I advocated internally for the Meridian partnership before the formal evaluation began. I didn't know that, Simone said. There was no reason for you to. It was a board conversation, not a contract conversation. Judith's gaze was steady and measuring in the way that people are measuring when they are deciding something and want to make the decision accurately. I want to tell you something honestly. I did not intervene when you were displaced. Simone waited. I thought about it, Judith said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who was not offering a justification, but an account, and I decided not to, and I want to be clear about why not, because I thought it was acceptable, but because I recognized that you didn't need a board member to rescue you. You needed what actually happened, which is to be witnessed fully by someone with the authority to make that witnessing mean something. And what does it mean, Simone said, in your position? It means that when I speak to the full board at our next meeting, which I will be doing with the account of every moment I watched tonight, I will be speaking not about an operational incident, but about the culture that produced it. The ease of it. Judith paused, the way it happened without hesitation. That ease is what needs explaining. Simone thought about the word ease and how precisely it named the thing that had disturbed her most. Not the displacement itself, which she had experienced in various forms throughout her career, but the fluid, unhurried confidence of it, the absence of any moment of doubt in Brittany Hale's posture or Derek Colton's settling into her seat, the way neither of them had seemed to consider that they might be wrong. The board has been aware of concerns about service equity in frontline operations, Judith said, for approximately 2 years. The awareness has not produced action because there has been no event that created sufficient visibility. Internal complaints are addressed internally. The pattern continues. Tonight is different, Simone said. It wasn't a question. Tonight is different because I was in 1A, Judith said, and because you are who you are, and because a young man in row 6 has been documenting everything for an audience that is, as of approximately 40 minutes ago, rather large. She paused. And because you chose to demonstrate consequences rather than simply describe them. They sat in a brief shared silence that was the silence of two women who understood power structures from the inside, understood the rules of engagement, the ways the system absorbed and neutralized the usual complaints, the specific kind of action that could produce a different result. I'll be at the 9 a.m. meeting, Judith said. I believe Mr. Whitfield has already been made aware that I'm on this flight. How did he respond to that information? With a level of focus, Judith said, with a slight trace of something that was not quite a smile but was in its neighborhood that suggests he is taking tomorrow's meeting very seriously. Simone nodded once, and the nod carried everything it needed to. She returned to 2A, and this time, when she sat down, she felt the full grounded certainty of someone who had come onto this flight as a passenger and was landing as something else, and the something else was not a victor. Victory had nothing to do with it, but a person who had made the room acknowledge what the room had done, and that was a different thing entirely, and it mattered in a way that was harder to name and deeper than winning. While Simone had been in the phone booth, and while the conversation with Whitfield had been finding its shape, the story had been spreading through the aircraft with the organic word-of-mouth velocity that information achieves when people are in an enclosed space with limited distraction and something genuinely extraordinary is happening in their immediate vicinity. Noah Park's thread had been building for 90 minutes and had crossed at some point over Ohio from a niche aviation-interested audience into the broader territory of things that people share because they make them feel something. And what the thread made people feel was a specific combination of outrage and satisfaction, and the particular catharsis of watching someone respond to injustice not by absorbing it but by making it count. And the combination was potent enough that the shares were accelerating rather than plateauing. The thread read in part, I'm on Meridian Flight 447, and I watched something tonight that I need people to understand happened in real time. A black female executive was removed from her confirmed first-class seat, which she booked 6 weeks ago and paid for to accommodate a white regional VP for the same airline who wanted it. No reason, no legitimate policy. The flight attendant cited a preferred guest protocol that, as far as anyone on this plane can establish, does not exist. The woman who was displaced did not argue, did not make a scene. She gathered her things and moved to premium economy. 20 minutes later, every Meridian flight in the country showed a security hold. The airline's CEO messaged the captain personally. The captain walked through the entire aircraft to escort her back to her original seat himself. She never raised her voice. Not once. The thread had 17,000 shares by the time the aircraft was over Colorado, and a journalist at the Seattle Times had reached out to Noah's DMs, and Meridian's communications director had sent her third message to Whitfield's assistant in 40 minutes. On the aircraft, the knowledge moved through the cabin in the lateral, person-to-person way that information travels in enclosed spaces. A whisper in business class, a phone shown to a seatmate in premium economy, the businessman in 9B who had been texting updates to his wife since before the seat restoration and whose wife had already told 4 of her friends. Elena Vasquez, doing her final beverage pass through the premium economy cabin, heard enough fragments of enough conversations to confirm what she had already pieced together, and the full picture settled over her with a combination of feelings that she would spend the next several days trying to sort through relief that the right thing had happened and something heavier and more complicated underneath it, which was the recognition of how close it had come to not happening, of how easily the original displacement would have stood if the woman in 5C had been anyone without her specific kind of leverage. She paused beside the seat where Simone had been sitting empty, now its occupant back in first class, and she stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. In business class, Derek Colton was in his seat with his phone face up on the tray table, and the phone had not stopped vibrating since he sat down, and the name appearing most frequently on the screen was someone at Meridian's executive office, and the conversation those calls produced had shifted the color of his face through several shades of unhappy in the last hour, and he was no longer watching anything on the seatback screen, and his noise-canceling headphones were in his bag. Brittany Hale was performing her duties with the mechanical precision of someone focused entirely on execution, because focusing entirely on execution was the only available alternative to thinking about certain other things, and she refreshed Simone's water glass in 2A without meeting her eyes, and Simone accepted it without comment, and the exchange contained more information than either of them spoke aloud. Captain Okafor's intercom announcement when it came was brief and carefully worded. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I'm pleased to tell you that the operational verification affecting Meridian's network is being resolved, and all systems will be returning to normal functionality shortly. Our flight continues on schedule, and we appreciate your patience." What the announcement did not say, what it could not say over a cabin P. A was that the operational verification had been resolved because the woman in 2A had agreed to resolve it, and that the agreement had conditions attached, and that those conditions were in the process of being drafted into a contract that would be signed in a conference room in Seattle in less than 12 hours. The cabin received the announcement with a murmur that was partly relief and partly the sound of people fitting the last piece into a picture they had been assembling for 90 minutes. In 6C, Noah Park sent one final tweet before putting his phone away. She never raised her voice, not once, and the whole thing still changed. Then he looked out the window at the lights of Denver 30,000 feet below and beautiful, and he thought that he had just watched the most precisely executed act of principled leverage he had ever seen, and that the most remarkable thing about it was how quiet it had been. The aircraft began its descent into Seattle somewhere over the eastern edge of Washington state, and the city appeared below them, gradually. First the distant glow of it against the dark, then the individual threads of highways and neighborhoods, then the specific geometry of the waterfront and the bridges, as the plane banked and aligned itself with the runway. And it was the kind of approach that reminded you, if you were in the mood to be reminded, that there was something remarkable about the fact that human beings had arranged to move themselves through the sky in metal tubes and arrive on time in specific places where other people were waiting. Simone had not slept. She had spent the descent hour in the particular productive focus of someone who has just navigated something significant and now needs to navigate what comes after it. Reviewing the revised contract clauses that Marcus Webb had drafted from the ground and sent to her tablet, the accountability benchmarks, the audit language, the third-party oversight provisions, all of it written with the precision of someone who had been Simone's COO for 9 years, and understood her standards precisely, and she had made 3 edits and approved the rest and sent it back with a note. "Good. Bring printed copies. We may need to revise in the room." The cabin had settled into the particular quiet of late-night flights nearing their end. The specific silence of 200 people returning from the suspension of travel back toward the logistics of being somewhere, retrieving items from overhead bins with the slightly dazed air of people who had been watching a film, and were now back in the physical world, folding their blankets, finding their shoes, composing their faces into the expressions they would wear when they deplaned. Elena Vasquez came through the cabin on her final pass, moving with the efficient grace of someone who knew her route through this space as well as she knew her own home. And when she reached 2A, she did not say anything. She simply set a fresh glass of water on the tray table with a deliberateness that was its own form of communication. The quiet acknowledgement of someone who was not in a position to say what she meant directly, but wanted it to be felt. Simone received it with the same quiet economy. In one, a Judith Calloway had put her book away and was looking out the window with an expression that was private and settled a woman who had watched something play out over 5 hours and was now organizing what she had seen into the language she would need for the conversation ahead of her. In business class, Derek Colton sat without reclining his posture, the posture of a man who had arrived at an airport 3 hours ago as one thing and was landing as another. And what the other thing was had not yet been fully named, but the naming was coming and he knew it. Brittany Hale moved through her landing procedures with the focused correctness of a professional who would not give anyone any cause for additional concern, and she did her job and she did it well, and somewhere underneath the professional surface something was running a different calculation, and what that calculation would produce was not yet visible. Noah Park had put his phone in his bag and was watching the city rise toward them. And he was not composing anything, not documenting anything. Just watching Seattle come up out of the dark, the way cities come up when you're landing at night, whole and complicated and lit from within by 10,000 private lives moving through their ordinary motions, unaware that anything particular had happened in the sky above them. Simone looked out the window at the approaching city and thought about her grandmother, Ida. Not the famous piece of advice, not the wisdom about switches and lights, but just the image of her specific and clear hands on a kitchen table in Baltimore. Coffee going cold, the Sunday morning light coming through the window behind her, and the particular quality of stillness she had that was not the stillness of someone waiting for something to happen, but the stillness of someone who had already decided what kind of person they were and did not need to revisit the question. The wheels came down. The runway rushed up to meet them. The aircraft docked at the Seattle gate with the smooth, practiced inevitability of a system working as it was designed to work, and the jetway connected, and the door opened, and the ordinary choreography of arrival began: the unbuckling of seatbelts, the retrieval of bags, the forward movement of 212 people toward the next phase of their evening. Captain James Okafor emerged from the cockpit. He walked directly to 2A, and he extended his hand and he said, "Ms. Carter," and nothing more because nothing more was needed. Simone shook it and she said, "Thank you, Captain Okafor," and she meant it as specifically as it is possible to mean something not as a courtesy, but as a precise acknowledgement of what he had done, which was to pull a booking record and see what it showed and act on what he saw without hesitation and without calculation about what acting might cost him. He held her gaze for a moment before releasing her hand. "I pulled your original booking," he said, and his voice was quiet and direct. 6 weeks ago, confirmed, paid in full, and what he was doing was not telling her something she didn't know, but creating a record between them, witness to witness, so that the truth of the situation existed in a form that had been stated aloud between two people who both knew it to be true. She nodded. He returned to the cockpit to complete his post-flight checks, and Simone began gathering her things, and the first-class cabin was doing the ordinary business of deplaning around her with the slight awkward formality of people who had shared an extraordinary experience and were now re-entering the ordinary world and didn't quite know the protocol for how to acknowledge what they'd witnessed. Judith Calloway paused beside her as she stood, and without ceremony or flourish, she placed a business card in Simone's hand and said 9 a.m. "I'll be in the room," and then continued toward the exit with the unhurried stride of someone who had no more to say and knew it. The other passengers deplaning through first class found reasons, small ones, subtle ones, to slow down near 2A to allow their eyes to rest on the woman in the navy dress. For a moment longer than passing strangers usually rest eyes on one another, and what they were looking for and what they found was the same thing. someone who had been asked to move and had not in the way that mattered. Brittany Hale was standing at the forward door, delivering the departure pleasantries to each passenger. "Thank you for flying with us. Safe travels, enjoy Seattle." And she delivered them with professional consistency. And when Simone reached the door, Brittany's posture shifted by some very small degree that was not visible in any one element, but was visible in the aggregate, and she opened her mouth and closed it once, and what she finally said was, "Safe travels, Miss Carter." And Simone said, "Thank you, Brittany," and walked off the jet bridge without looking back. It was not forgiveness, and it was not absolution, and it was not the beginning of a reconciliation. It was simply the acknowledgement that the thing had happened, and that Brittany had said her name, and that names matter, and that was enough for now. Derek Colton had deplaned through the business class door and was already somewhere in the terminal gone before she reached the jetway, and his absence was its own statement about what he understood about the situation. In the terminal, she was pulling her carry-on toward the rideshare exit when she heard quick footsteps behind her and turned to find Noah Park slightly breathless, his bag over one shoulder. He stopped a respectful distance away. He didn't ask for anything. Didn't produce a phone. Didn't ask for a photo. Didn't frame a story around himself. Didn't perform the recognition. He just said simply and directly, "I'm glad you were on that flight." Simone looked at him, at the sincerity of it, at the fact that he had run to catch her just to say that single thing, and she said, "So am I," and she meant it in a way that was larger than the flight, larger than the evening, larger than herself, the way you can sometimes mean something when it has been earned rather than assumed. He nodded once and turned back toward the terminal, and she continued toward the exit, and the automatic doors opened for her, and the Seattle night air came in cool and specific, and full of the particular smell of the Pacific Northwest evergreen and salt and cold pavement, and she walked through it. The conference room on the 14th floor of Meridian Airways Seattle headquarters had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Elliott Bay and in the 9 a.m. light. The water was the specific gray-blue of a Pacific morning in autumn, and the container ships moved on it with the patient slowness of very large things that understand they don't need to hurry. Grant Whitfield was at the head of the table when Simone arrived with Marcus Webb and her legal team, 2 attorneys who had been up until 2 a.m. finalizing the revised contract language, and beside Whitfield sat his CDO and 2 members of his legal department, and 3 seats down, arranged with the unhurried composure of someone who had already been there for 20 minutes, was Judith Calloway. The introductions were brief. Whitfield looked at Simone across the table with the expression of a man who had spent the night thinking carefully about what he was going to say, and had arrived at something closer to honesty than he had originally planned. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to acknowledge directly and on behalf of Meridian Airways what occurred on Flight 447 last night. Not the operational disruption, what preceded it. What was done to you was wrong, and it was wrong in ways that go beyond a single flight attendant making a bad judgment call in the moment." Simone let the statement stand without filling the silence after it. "I'd like to proceed to the contract," she said. The revised language was presented. Meridian's attorneys flagged 2 clauses as precedent-setting within the industry, the quarterly demographic reporting requirement and the independent audit provision, and noted that full implementation would require board approval for certain elements. "The board is prepared to move forward," Judith Calloway said from her seat 3 places down, and the statement landed in the room with the specific gravity of something that had already been decided, and Meridian's attorneys exchanged a glance and returned to the document. The discussion that followed was thorough and specific and occasionally contentious on matters of implementation timeline and audit scope, and Simone's legal team held each clause with the patient precision of people who understood that the language they were establishing would outlast the meeting and needed to say exactly what it meant, and Marcus Webb handled the technical specifications with the authority of someone who had lived inside the architecture for 9 years. The contract was signed at 10:47 a.m., $700 million, 3 years, with the new clauses intact and a review timeline that would produce the first demographic service report within 90 days. When the room had emptied down to Whitfield and Simone and the Seattle morning outside the window, Whitfield stood with his coffee and looked out at the bay for a moment before he said, "You could have walked away from this. From the contract. From all of it. You had leverage. You could have used it differently, burned the table, and let the story tell itself." He turned. A lot of people would have. Simone considered the question seriously, the way she always tried to consider serious questions. "Burning things down is easy," she said. "It feels like something. But it doesn't build anything in the place of what it destroys." She picked up her bag. "The contract is the point. The clauses are the point. Something that makes it different for the next person, that's the point." Whitfield nodded. She crossed the room and shook his hand at the door and walked out into the hallway where Marcus was waiting with the printed contract copies in a leather folio, and she said, "Let's go." And they walked toward the elevator, and the bay was visible through the window at the end of the hall, patient and gray and enormous, and she did not look back. That evening Simone stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her Seattle hotel room with the city spread below her, and the bay beyond it catching the last of the light, and she held a glass of water. Not champagne, not wine, just water. The same thing she had asked for when they brought her back to seat 2A. And she thought about the day, not as a crisis navigated or a victory claimed, but as a thing that had happened and was now finished, replaced by something more durable in its place. 200 people at Apex Digital who would come to work tomorrow without knowing how close the contract had come to unraveling, and the passengers in smaller markets who would eventually board Meridian flights that ran on time because the infrastructure worked, and the quarterly audit that would produce in 90 days a document that required a major airline to count and name and account for who it treated as worthy of dignity and who it did not. And the number of people who would read that document without knowing the name of the woman who had made it a contractual requirement would far exceed the number who would. She thought about Elena Vasquez, still somewhere in the air, or on her way home, carrying the quiet weight of someone who had witnessed everything and said little and would go back to work tomorrow in a cabin where the rules were the same. But something underneath them had shifted, and she thought about Captain Okafor pulling a booking record with the simple, insistent belief that documentation is a form of justice. And she thought about Judith Calloway choosing to witness instead of intervene, and understanding precisely the difference between the two. Her phone lit up on the nightstand. Marcus Webb contracts filed. Audit clause cleared by Meridian Legal. Press asking for comment. 4 words. Or 40. She picked up the phone and typed her reply. Let the contract speak, and set it back down, and below her the city moved with the ordinary momentum of 10,000 ordinary evenings, and somewhere across town a Meridian gate agent handed a boarding pass for seat 2A to a black woman in a burgundy coat, and said simply, without hesitation, without a second glance, "Enjoy your flight." And the woman took it and walked toward the gate, and it was a small thing, and it was everything, and neither of them knew it had been earned. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support is what allows us to keep telling stories about dignity, justice, and the kind of quiet courage that changes things without making noise. Have you ever watched someone respond to injustice, not with anger, but with precision? Tell us in the comments. We read every one.